On March 20th, 1943, U-boat U-384 was operating in the North Atlantic, 400 miles southwest of Iceland. The submarine had been submerged for 14 hours, evading British destroyers hunting German U-boats. At 14:30 hours, the hydrophone operator reported propeller sounds approaching from the southeast. The captain ordered the crew to silent running, engines reduced to minimum power, all non-essential equipment shut down, crew members ordered to remain motionless and silent. At 14:45 hours, the first depth charge detonated 50 meters from the submarine. The explosion created a pressure wave that struck the hull with the force of a hammer blow. The submarine shuddered violently. Light bulbs shattered. Instruments broke loose from their mounts. Men were thrown to the deck. A second explosion followed, closer this time, 30 meters. The hull groaned as metal compressed under pressure. Leaks appeared in pipe joints. Water sprayed into the compartments. The crew knew what was happening. They were under attack by depth charges, explosive devices designed to crush submarines by detonating near the hull. German U-boats were the most effective anti-shipping weapon of World War II, sinking over 3,000 Allied merchant ships and warships. However, U-boat crews suffered the highest casualty rate of any military branch in the war. Of approximately 40,000 German submariners who served in U-boats, over 30,000 were killed, a 75% mortality rate. The primary cause of death was depth charge attacks by Allied destroyers, frigates, and corvettes equipped with sonar and coordinated anti-submarine tactics. A depth charge attack was a unique form of combat. The crew could not see the enemy. They could not fight back effectively while submerged. They could only wait in darkness, listening to the sounds of approaching warships and the explosions of depth charges detonating around them. The experience combined physical danger with psychological terror. The certainty that the next explosion might crush the hull, flood the submarine, and kill everyone aboard. This analysis examines what happened inside a U-boat during a depth charge attack from the crew's perspective. U-boats operated on the surface whenever possible, using diesel engines for speed and to recharge batteries. When enemy ships or aircraft were detected, the submarine crash dived, submerging in 30 to 60 seconds. Once submerged, the U-boat switched to electric motors powered by batteries, which were quieter and harder to detect. Allied warships hunting U-boats used sonar, called ASDIC by the British. Sonar transmitted sound pulses through water. When a pulse struck a submarine hull, it reflected back, revealing the submarine's location and distance. U-boat crews heard sonar pings as metallic clicking sounds. The sound was distinct and unmistakable. Hearing it meant the enemy had detected the submarine. When sonar contact was established, the U-boat's captain had limited options. He could attempt to evade by changing depth and course. He could dive deeper, below the effective range of depth charges, though this risked exceeding the submarine's maximum safe depth. Or he could attempt to outrun the warship using battery power, though batteries depleted rapidly. The crew's first indication of attack was the hydrophone operator's report. Propeller sounds, bearing, range closing. The hydrophone operator listened through headphones connected to underwater microphones. He could hear propeller sounds from miles away and identify ship types. As the enemy approached, the captain ordered silent running. All non-essential equipment was shut down. Crew members were ordered to remain silent and motionless. Even small sounds could be detected by enemy sonar. The psychological effect of silent running was profound. The submarine was dark. Lights were dimmed to conserve battery power. Ventilation was reduced, and the air became hot and humid. Carbon dioxide levels increased, causing headaches and difficulty breathing. The crew could hear the enemy ship's propellers growing louder, a rhythmic thudding sound. Some crew members prayed. Others wrote final letters to families. Most simply waited, knowing their survival depended on luck and the captain's decisions. Depth charges were cylindrical containers filled with 150 to 300 kilograms of high explosive. They were dropped or launched from the attacking warship and sank at a rate of approximately 3 to 4 meters per second. A hydrostatic fuse set to a specific depth triggered detonation when the charge reached that depth. Warships typically dropped patterns of multiple depth charges, often 6 to 12 charges spaced to cover an area where the submarine was believed to be. The first depth charge detonation was terrifying. The explosion created a massive pressure wave that traveled through water at 1,500 meters per second, 5 times faster than sound travels through air. When the pressure wave struck the submarine hull, the entire vessel shuddered violently. Men standing or sitting were thrown to the deck or slammed against bulkheads. Equipment not secured broke loose. Glass dials and light bulbs shattered, showering compartments with fragments. The sound was overwhelming, a deafening roar that caused physical pain in the ears and left crew members temporarily deaf. The pressure wave caused immediate structural damage, even if the charge detonated tens of meters away. The submarine hull was designed to withstand external water pressure at depth, but depth charge explosions applied force in unpredictable directions. Hull plates flexed inward, sometimes cracking or separating at welds. Rivets popped loose, pipe joints separated, causing leaks. Seawater sprayed into compartments under high pressure, soaking equipment and crew. Electrical systems short-circuited, causing fires or releasing toxic fumes. Interior equipment suffered catastrophic failure. Gauges and instruments shattered. Battery cells cracked, leaking sulfuric acid. Compressed air lines ruptured. Hydraulic systems lost pressure. The submarine's depth control became compromised. Without functioning depth gauges, the crew could not determine their current depth or control descent and ascent accurately. Loss of depth control was potentially fatal. The submarine could sink below crush depth or surface into enemy fire unintentionally. Crew members experienced physical injuries from the explosions. The pressure wave caused internal injuries, ruptured eardrums, lung damage, internal bleeding. Men thrown against metal surfaces suffered broken bones, lacerations, and concussions. Shrapnel from broken equipment caused cuts and puncture wounds. In the confined space of the submarine, there was no safe place to take cover. Every compartment was exposed to the effects of nearby explosions. After the first depth charge, the crew knew more were coming. Allied doctrine called for saturation attacks. Multiple depth charges dropped in patterns to increase the probability of a hit or near miss. The crew braced for the next explosion, not knowing when or where it would occur, or whether it would be the one that breached the hull. After the initial explosions, the submarine remained submerged in silent running mode. The crew waited in darkness, listening for the sounds of the attacking warship. The only illumination came from emergency lighting, dim red lights that preserved night vision but provided minimal visibility. The air was thick with humidity, sweat, and the smell of oil, diesel fuel, and human bodies confined in close quarters. The psychological strain of silent running was extreme. Crew members could not speak, move unnecessarily, or make any sound that might be detected by enemy sonar. Communication was limited to hand signals or whispered orders. Men sat or lay motionless, controlling their breathing to minimize noise. The silence amplified every sound. The creak of the hull under pressure, the drip of water from leaks, the distant thud of the enemy ship's propellers. Time distorted during silent running. Minutes felt like hours. The crew had no way to know how long the attack would last or when it would end. Some attacks lasted hours, with the enemy warship circling above, dropping depth charges periodically to force the submarine to surface or exhaust its batteries. Crew members experienced intense fear, knowing that the next explosion could kill them. Some lost control of bodily functions due to fear. Others hyperventilated or experienced panic attacks, but could not cry out or move without endangering everyone. The hydrophone operator provided updates on the enemy's position. Propellers bearing 270 degrees, range closing. Screws accelerating, preparing to drop charges. These reports allowed the crew to anticipate attacks, but also intensified fear. Hearing that the enemy was directly overhead, preparing to drop depth charges, was psychologically devastating. Men knew the next explosion was seconds away, but could do nothing to protect themselves. Temperature inside the submarine increased rapidly during silent running. With ventilation systems shut down or minimized, heat from equipment, engines, and human bodies accumulated. Temperatures in some compartments exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. Crew members stripped to undershirts or bare chests, but sweat-soaked clothing and ran in streams down faces and bodies. Dehydration became a concern, but water supplies were rationed and drinking made noise. Carbon dioxide levels rose as the crew exhaled and ventilation was inadequate. High CO2 caused headaches, dizziness, nausea, and impaired judgment. Crew members became lethargic and struggled to perform tasks. In extreme cases, CO2 buildup caused unconsciousness. The captain had to balance the need for silent running, which required minimal ventilation, against the need to keep the crew functional. Some crew members coped by retreating into themselves mentally, dissociating from the situation. Others prayed or repeated mantras silently. A few men wrote letters to families, assuming they would die and hoping the letters would be found if the wreck was recovered. The letters described fear, resignation, and love for families they would never see again. Each depth charge explosion tested the submarine's hull integrity. Even charges detonating 50 to 100 meters away caused cumulative damage. The hull was constructed of welded steel plates designed to withstand water pressure at operational depths, typically 100 to 200 meters. However, repeated pressure waves from multiple explosions weakened welds, cracked plates, and stressed structural members beyond design limits. Leaks were the most immediate threat. Pipe joints, valve seals, and hull penetrations where pipes or shafts passed through the pressure hull were vulnerable points. Explosions caused these joints to separate or crack, allowing seawater to spray into the submarine under high pressure. A small leak, a stream the diameter of a finger, could flood a compartment in minutes if not stopped. Crew members used wooden plugs, rags, or their own bodies to block leaks temporarily while damage control teams attempted repairs. Major leaks required isolating compartments. Watertight doors were sealed to prevent flooding from spreading. Crew members in flooded compartments had to evacuate before the doors were closed, or they would be trapped and drown. Some men were lost this way, trapped in compartments that flooded too quickly to escape. Their deaths were necessary to save the submarine and the rest of the crew. Flooding caused additional problems beyond the immediate danger of drowning. Water entering the submarine increased weight, causing the vessel to sink deeper. If flooding was not controlled, the submarine would exceed its maximum safe depth and implode. Water also contaminated battery cells, causing them to release chlorine gas, a toxic substance that caused respiratory failure and death within minutes. Chlorine gas leaks required immediate evacuation of affected compartments and use of emergency breathing apparatus, which was in limited supply. Structural damage manifested as deformation of the hull. In extreme cases, hull plates buckled inward, reducing interior space and crushing equipment or crew members against bulkheads. The sound of metal groaning and creaking indicated the hull was under extreme stress. Crew members listened to these sounds, trying to determine whether the hull would hold or collapse. The uncertainty was agonizing. The captain monitored depth carefully, using whatever instruments remained functional. If the submarine descended below safe limits, he ordered ballast tanks blown. Compressed air was forced into ballast tanks to expel water and provide buoyancy. However, blowing ballast made noise that revealed the submarine's position and often caused the submarine to surface, exposing it to gunfire. The decision to blow ballast was a last resort, made only when the alternative was certain death by implosion. U-boats relied on electric batteries for submerged propulsion. The batteries, lead-acid cells stored in compartments beneath the crew spaces, powered electric motors that drove the propellers. Battery capacity was limited. At cruising speed, a fully charged battery allowed approximately 24 hours of submerged operation. At higher speeds, or during evasive maneuvers, battery life decreased to a few hours. During a depth charge attack, the captain had to balance competing demands. Evading the enemy required speed and frequent course changes, which depleted batteries rapidly. Extending battery life required moving slowly or remaining stationary, which made evasion difficult. As batteries depleted, available power decreased, lights dimmed, ventilation stopped, electric motors lost power, reducing the submarine's ability to maneuver. Battery depletion was a death sentence if the attack continued. Without power, the submarine could not control its depth, maneuver to evade, or operate life support systems. The crew would suffocate as oxygen was consumed and carbon dioxide accumulated. The only option was to surface, which meant exposing the submarine to enemy fire. Surfacing during an attack often resulted in the submarine being sunk by gunfire or ramming. Depth charge explosions caused additional battery problems. The violent shaking cracked battery cells, causing them to leak sulfuric acid and seawater into the battery compartments. When seawater contacted battery acid, a chemical reaction produced chlorine gas, a yellow-green gas that was heavier than air and accumulated in lower compartments. Chlorine gas was highly toxic. Exposure caused severe respiratory distress, burns to the lungs and eyes, and death within minutes at high concentrations. Chlorine gas leaks were detected by smell. Chlorine has a distinctive, sharp, choking odor. When chlorine was detected, crew members donned emergency breathing masks, potash cartridge masks that filtered chlorine for a limited time. However, masks were in short supply, and not every crew member could be equipped. Those without masks evacuated affected compartments immediately and sealed watertight doors to contain the gas. Crew members trapped in compartments with chlorine and no masks suffocated or were poisoned. Dealing with chlorine gas required ventilating the affected compartment, which meant using ventilation systems that consumed battery power and made noise detectable by enemy sonar. Alternatively, the submarine could surface to ventilate, but this exposed it to attack. Captains faced impossible choices: remain submerged and let crew members die from chlorine poisoning, or surface and risk destruction by enemy fire. Battery fires were another hazard. Short circuits caused by seawater or structural damage ignited hydrogen gas released by batteries during operation. Battery fires produced intense heat and toxic fumes and were difficult to extinguish in the confined space of the battery compartment. Firefighting efforts consumed oxygen and generated smoke, further degrading air quality. Uncontrolled battery fires forced evacuation of the submarine. As the attack continued, the captain assessed the submarine's condition and made critical decisions. The primary options were to continue evading while submerged, attempt to escape by diving deeper, or surface and fight or surrender. Continuing to evade required functional systems and sufficient battery power. If the submarine retained maneuverability and stealth, the captain could attempt to break sonar contact by changing course and speed unpredictably, using thermal layers in the water to disrupt sonar, or lying motionless on the sea floor if depth allowed. Successful evasion required luck. The enemy had to lose sonar contact or abandon the search. Many U-boats survived attacks by remaining submerged and motionless for hours until the enemy departed. Diving deeper was a desperate tactic. German U-boats had a maximum safe depth called the test depth, typically 200 meters for Type 7 U-boats, the most common class. Exceeding test depth risked hull implosion but diving deep placed the submarine below the effective range of many depth charges, which were set to detonate at shallower depths. Captains sometimes ordered dives to 250 or 300 meters, well beyond safe limits, hoping the hull would withstand the pressure long enough to escape. The crew could hear the hull groaning and creaking as external pressure increased. Some submarines imploded at extreme depth, killing everyone instantly. Surfacing was the last resort. Once surfaced, the submarine was vulnerable to gunfire, ramming, and additional depth charges. However, surfacing allowed the crew to abandon ship if the submarine was sinking, use deck guns to fight back, or surrender if resistance was futile. Surfacing also recharged batteries using diesel engines and ventilated the interior, removing toxic gases and replenishing oxygen. If the captain decided to surface, he ordered ballast tanks blown. Compressed air forced water out of ballast tanks, providing buoyancy. The submarine ascended rapidly, often breaking the surface at steep angles. The crew braced for impact as the submarine punched through the surface. Once on the surface, the captain opened the conning tower hatch, and crew members scrambled to deck gun positions or prepared to abandon ship. Surfacing during an attack was often fatal. Enemy warships immediately opened fire with deck guns. Shells struck the submarine's hull, conning tower, and deck, killing crew members and causing additional flooding. If the submarine could not dive again, the captain ordered abandon ship. Crew members jumped into the ocean, hoping to be rescued. Many drowned in rough seas or were not recovered. Some were taken prisoner. A few were machine-gunned in the water by enemy ships that considered them combatants. Surrender was possible if the enemy accepted it. The captain could signal surrender by raising a white flag or transmitting a distress signal. However, not all enemy warships accepted surrender, especially early in the war when anti-submarine warfare was conducted ruthlessly. Some U-boat crews that surrendered were taken prisoner. Others were killed in the water or left to drown. The worst outcome of a depth charge attack was a direct or near hit that breached the pressure hull. When the hull was penetrated, seawater flooded into the submarine under immense pressure. At 100 meters depth, water pressure was 10 atmospheres, 10 times atmospheric pressure at the surface. A breach caused water to jet into the interior with lethal force, knocking crew members off their feet and rapidly flooding compartments. Flooding progressed rapidly. A small breach could flood a compartment in seconds. Crew members had no time to react. Those closest to the breach were struck by the water jet, a force powerful enough to break bones or crush bodies against bulkheads. Others were swept away by the rushing water and drowned as the compartment filled. Watertight doors were supposed to be sealed to contain flooding, but in many cases crew members were trapped on the wrong side of the doors and drowned before they could escape. As compartments flooded, the submarine lost buoyancy and sank deeper. The descent accelerated as more compartments flooded. The crew in unflooded compartments felt the submarine tilting as weight shifted. They knew flooding was occurring and that the submarine was sinking. The captain ordered emergency blow, forcing compressed air into all ballast tanks simultaneously to provide maximum buoyancy. But if flooding was too extensive, the submarine could not be saved. If the submarine sank below crush depth, the hull imploded. Crush depth varied by submarine class, but was typically 250 to 350 meters for German U-boats. At crush depth, external water pressure exceeded the hull's structural strength. The hull collapsed inward suddenly and catastrophically. The implosion was instantaneous. Crew members were killed by the collapsing hull, the pressure wave, or drowning as the interior filled with water in seconds. Survivors of implosions reported, in cases where submarines sank in shallow water and some crew members escaped, that the sound was like a massive hammer blow. The hull crumpled like paper. Bulkheads and decks collapsed. Equipment was crushed. The crew had no time to react. Death was instantaneous for most. A few crew members in isolated compartments survived the initial implosion, but drowned as the submarine sank to the seafloor. Submarines that sank became tombs. The crew's bodies remained inside, entombed in the wreck. Families were notified that their loved ones were missing and presumed dead. No bodies were recovered. The submarines lay on the seafloor, some at depths exceeding 1,000 meters, undiscovered for decades. Modern sonar and underwater exploration have located many wrecks. They are treated as war graves and remain undisturbed. Most U-boat crews that survived depth charge attacks did so because the enemy lost sonar contact or exhausted their depth charges and departed. Successful evasion required the submarine to remain submerged and undetected for hours, sometimes an entire day, until the threat passed. During this time, the crew endured darkness, heat, depleted air, and fear, not knowing if the enemy had truly departed or was waiting silently above. When the captain determined it was safe, he ordered the submarine to surface. The crew opened hatches and flooded the interior with fresh air. Diesel engines were started to recharge batteries. The crew assessed damage and conducted repairs. In many cases, damage was severe enough that the submarine had to abort its mission and return to base. Some submarines were so badly damaged they barely made it back, limping into port with fractured hulls, flooded compartments, and exhausted crews. Crew members who survived attacks were traumatized. The experience of waiting in darkness, expecting death at any moment, left psychological scars. Many suffered from what would now be recognized as PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, and difficulty sleeping. Submariners were redeployed on subsequent patrols with little time to recover psychologically. Some refused to return to duty, risking court-martial. Others returned but were less effective, haunted by their experiences. Approximately 75% of German submariners, 30,000 of 40,000, were killed during the war. The majority died in depth charge attacks or from subsequent sinking. Others died when submarines were sunk by torpedoes, mines, or aircraft bombs. The casualty rate was the highest of any military branch in any nation during World War II. Submariners knew the odds and accepted the risk, but the reality of the danger was overwhelming. The survivors carried memories of comrades who died. They remembered the sounds of the hull being crushed, the screams of men drowning, the smell of chlorine gas and burning electrical insulation. They remembered the faces of friends who did not return. After the war, survivors formed associations and commemorated the dead. Memorials to U-boat crews emphasized the sacrifice and suffering of men who fought in a form of combat that combined physical danger with unrelenting psychological terror. The experience of a depth charge attack inside a U-boat represents one of the most extreme forms of combat stress in military history. The crew could not see the enemy, could not fight back effectively, and could do nothing but wait and hope the hull would hold. Most did not survive. Those who did carried the experience for the rest of their lives. The submarines rest on the seafloor, memorials to the 30,000 men who died in darkness beneath the waves.